On a blazing summer day in 378 AD, an empire that had ruled the known world for centuries marched toward its greatest test. At Adrianople, Rome, mighty, disciplined, and proud, would collide with an enemy it thought inferior. What followed was not just a battle, but a disaster so shocking it shattered the illusion of Rome's invincibility and changed the fate of Western civilization forever. The Roman Empire of the 4th century stood as a colossus straddling 2 continents. From the sunlit Mediterranean shores to the cold forests of Germania, Rome's legions had marched for centuries, conquering, defending, and projecting the power of emperors who claimed dominion over the known world. Yet beneath this facade of strength, cracks had begun to form. The empire was divided, east and west, with 2 emperors struggling to maintain unity against mounting threats. One of the greatest threats came not from the Persians in the east, nor from rival claimants to the throne, but from a tide of desperate refugees, the Goths. Pushed from their homelands by the relentless advance of the Huns, tens of thousands of Gothic families flooded toward the Danube frontier. They did not come as conquerors, but as people seeking safety. Women, children, elders, and warriors alike begged Rome for asylum. The Roman Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, saw opportunity. He could admit the Goths into imperial territory, recruit their warriors into his armies, and gain new settlers for underpopulated lands. But greed and corruption poisoned the process. Roman officials exploited the Goths, extorting food and gold, even trading rotten meat and dog carcasses in exchange for their children sold into slavery. Hunger and betrayal festered into anger. By the late 300s and 70s, the Goths were no longer a refugee people. They had become an armed rebellion inside Rome's own borders. Valens, proud and ambitious, wanted glory. His Western co-emperor Gratian had just scored victories against Germanic tribes. Valens feared being overshadowed. When reports reached him that the Gothic leader Fritigern was gathering forces in Thrace, Valens saw his chance. Against the advice of his generals, he marched his legions northward in the sweltering heat of summer. The march was grueling. Roman soldiers, weighed down by armor and supplies, trudged across the plains under a blazing sun. Supply lines stretched thin. Scouts brought conflicting reports. Some said the Goths were few, disorganized, and on the verge of surrender. Others warned of a massive host hidden beyond the hills. On the morning of August 9th, 378, the Roman army approached the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne in Turkey. Dust rose from the earth as tens of thousands of soldiers assembled. Infantry in heavy formation, cavalry waiting on the wings, standards fluttering in the dry wind. Valens believed he faced only 20 to 30,000 Goths. In truth, Fritigern commanded nearly double that number, reinforced by cavalry still arriving on the battlefield. The stage was set for catastrophe. The sun rose over the plains of Thrace, burning through the morning haze. The Roman army, numbering perhaps 30,000 men, formed ranks outside the walls of Adrianople. They were tired from days of forced marching, their throats dry, their armor hot to the touch. Yet the discipline of centuries still held. Standards rose, trumpets sounded, and the legions prepared for battle. Valens, mounted on a white horse, surveyed the field. He believed his scouts. The Goths were disorganized, their numbers smaller than Rome's. Victory, he thought, would be swift, decisive, and his alone. If he could crush the Goths before Gratian arrived from the west, all the glory would belong to him. His name would be remembered beside the great emperors of old. But across the dry hills, Gothic tents stretched as far as the eye could see. Fritigern, the Gothic leader, knew he could not match Roman discipline in a straight clash. Instead, he relied on cunning and time. He sent envoys to Valens under flags of truce, asking for negotiations, requesting food and land. In truth, he was buying precious hours, waiting for his cavalry to return from raiding. The Romans grew restless. Standing beneath the blazing sun in heavy armor, they baked in the heat. Soldiers murmured angrily. Their commanders urged Valens to wait, to rest the army, or to coordinate with Gratian, who was marching with reinforcements. But Valens feared hesitation would cost him the honor of victory. His pride outweighed caution. By midday, tensions sharpened. Skirmishes broke out along the flanks as Roman light infantry clashed with Gothic foragers. Clouds of dust rose, arrows whistled, and the uneasy truce dissolved. Fritigern smiled. Every hour that passed worked in his favor. He stretched out the negotiations, keeping the Romans under the punishing sun. His warriors, lightly armed, could endure the weight. The Romans, encumbered and dehydrated, could not. And beyond the horizon, the thunder of hooves grew louder. The Gothic cavalry was returning. Still, Valens pushed forward. He ordered the advance before his army was fully organized. Units moved piecemeal, columns breaking formation as they tried to close the distance to the Gothic camp. Discipline frayed, cohesion weakened. It was the opening Fritigern had been waiting for. The first Roman units surged forward, shields locked, spears leveled, and standards carried high. Their trumpets blared, echoing across the dry hills. Dust rose in thick clouds, shrouding the battlefield. The Roman infantry, veterans of countless campaigns, advanced with grim determination toward the Gothic wagon circle. A defensive laager where families, supplies, and warriors huddled together. Inside the wagon camp, Gothic women and children cried out in fear, while warriors clashed their weapons against shields, shouting war cries that rolled like thunder. They were not merely defending their homes, they were fighting for survival itself. Fritigern delayed no longer. He ordered his warriors to hold the line, trading arrows and spears with the advancing Romans. But his true plan was unfolding beyond the dust. His messengers rode hard to summon the cavalry. Already the distant rumble of hooves shook the ground. On the Roman left flank, heavy infantry pressed against Gothic defenders, their discipline showing. Shield walls advanced step by step, driving the Goths backward. For a moment it seemed Rome might succeed. The legion's iron discipline had carried them through centuries, and here too it seemed to prevail. But cracks appeared. The heat was unbearable. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Cohesion faltered as units broke formation, desperate for water or relief, and still no decisive breakthrough came. Then came the turning point. From beyond the hills to the north, the Gothic cavalry arrived, thousands of horsemen armored and swift, descending like a storm. They had been away raiding the countryside, and now at the perfect moment, they returned to the battlefield. The thunder of hooves grew deafening. Dust clouds split open as wave after wave of Gothic riders swept down upon the Roman flanks. The Romans, already stretched and disorganized, could not react in time. Their own cavalry, far fewer in number, was quickly overwhelmed and scattered. Panic rippled through the Roman ranks. Soldiers shouted warnings. Officers struggled to rally their men. The neat formations of the legions dissolved into confusion. And still, the cavalry pressed in, circling like wolves, cutting down stragglers, driving wedges into the Roman line. Valens, positioned at the rear, watched as his vision of victory unraveled. What he had dismissed as a ragged enemy force had revealed itself as a trap. He tried to issue commands, but signals were lost in the chaos. By late afternoon, the battle had transformed into a slaughter. The Roman left flank, once steady, collapsed under relentless cavalry charges. The center, pressed on all sides, struggled to hold. Heat, exhaustion, and terror consumed the army. The might of Rome was being broken piece by piece. As the afternoon sun sank lower, the Roman army was trapped in a tightening vice. The Gothic cavalry, relentless and merciless, circled the battlefield, driving the legions inward upon themselves. Clouds of dust mixed with smoke from burning wagons. The screams of men and horses filled the air. At first, the Romans tried to stand their ground. Shield walls locked, spears thrust outward, they fought as they had for centuries. But the battlefield was no longer one of discipline, it was chaos. Columns of infantry were crushed together, unable to maneuver. Arrows rained down from Gothic archers, positioned on higher ground, piercing armor, felling officers, sowing confusion. On the right flank, Roman units attempted a desperate counterattack, charging into the mass of Gothic riders. For a moment, they pushed the enemy back, but then came another wave of horsemen, armored in scale and chain, wielding spears with deadly precision. The Roman cavalry collapsed, fleeing in panic. The infantry, exposed and surrounded, was left to die. Panic became contagion. Entire cohorts broke formation, scattering in all directions. Once the line cracked, the collapse spread like wildfire. What had begun as a battle now became a rout. Some Romans fled toward Adrianople itself, hoping the city walls would offer safety. But gates closed in their faces. The townspeople feared opening the city to a flood of fleeing soldiers and Gothic pursuers. Others ran blindly across the plains, cut down by cavalry that hunted them mercilessly. In the midst of the chaos was Emperor Valens. Accounts differ on his final moments. Some claim he was wounded by an arrow and carried to a nearby farmhouse. The Goths, not knowing he was the emperor, set the building aflame, burning him alive inside. Others believe he died on the battlefield, unrecognizable among the fallen. What is certain is that Valens, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, vanished into the smoke and blood, never to be seen again. The slaughter continued until evening. Tens of thousands of Romans lay dead, their armor glinting red beneath the setting sun. Nearly 2/3 of the imperial army had been destroyed. Roman officers, senators, and commanders perished in droves. The fields outside Adrianople became a graveyard of empire. For the Goths, it was a triumph beyond imagining. A refugee people, once starved and betrayed, had annihilated the mightiest army of the ancient world. For Rome, it was not just a defeat, it was humiliation, disaster, and a glimpse of a darker future. The Battle of Adrianople marked one of the bloodiest days in Roman history. The Eastern army, painstakingly raised and trained, had been wiped out in a single afternoon. And the empire, once thought eternal, now faced the terrifying reality of its own vulnerability. The morning after Adrianople, silence hung over the battlefield, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the cawing of carrion birds. Where once an imperial army had stood, now lay a field of corpses, Roman and Gothic alike, but overwhelmingly Roman. Armor and weapons glittered in the dawn light, scattered among broken standards and the charred remains of wagons. The smell of death carried for miles. News of the disaster spread with terrifying speed. In Constantinople, panic erupted. Rumors claimed the emperor had been burned alive, or cut down by barbarians, or vanished altogether. The truth mattered little. The fact was that Valens was dead, and with him, the Eastern Roman army. The road to the imperial capital lay open. For the citizens of the empire, the loss was incomprehensible. Rome had known defeats before, at Cannae against Hannibal, at Carrhae against the Parthians. But this was different. Those defeats had occurred far from the heart of the empire. Adrianople was in Thrace, a heartbeat away from Constantinople itself. And the foe was not a distant superpower, but a people Rome had once agreed to shelter. The Gothic survivors, emboldened by their victory, surged across the countryside. Towns were plundered, villages abandoned, fields burned. Refugees fled in every direction, carrying tales of horror. For a moment, it seemed as if the empire itself might collapse. Yet despite their triumph, the Goths lacked the means to finish Rome. They had no siege engines to storm Constantinople, no centralized command to sustain a campaign. The city's towering walls, recently reinforced, proved impenetrable. The Goths ravaged the countryside but could not seize the imperial heart. Still, the damage was done. 2/3 of the Eastern field army had been wiped out. Hundreds of officers and commanders were dead. Rebuilding such a force would take years. For the empire, manpower was no longer infinite. The legions, once symbols of inexhaustible strength, were revealed as fragile. Politically, the death of Valens destabilized the East. His successor, Theodosius I, would inherit not a triumphant empire, but one reeling from disaster. He was forced to negotiate to settle the Goths within imperial lands as foederati, federated allies allowed to live inside Rome's borders, armed and semi-independent. It was a compromise born of necessity, but it planted a seed of future peril. For the first time, Rome admitted that it could not simply crush invaders. It had to coexist with them. The psychological shock was perhaps even greater than the military loss. Rome had long believed itself invincible. The idea that barbarians could annihilate a Roman field army and kill an emperor was unthinkable. After Adrianople, that illusion was gone. The empire had been humbled. Historians would later call Adrianople the beginning of the end, the moment when the Roman world shifted irreversibly toward decline. Though the empire would endure for another century in the West and even longer in the East, the seeds of collapse had been sown in the dust outside Adrianople. In the centuries that followed, the name Adrianople carried a weight of dread in Roman memory. It was not simply a lost battle, it was a turning point, a moment when the ancient world shifted on its axis. For the Roman Empire, the lessons were brutal. First, Adrianople revealed the limits of Roman power. For centuries, the legions had seemed unstoppable. They had crushed Carthage, tamed Gaul, conquered Britain, and marched across 3 continents. But here, in the fields of Thrace, they had been annihilated not by another empire, but by displaced tribes fighting for survival. The invincibility of Rome was an illusion, and illusions, once shattered, cannot be restored. Second, Adrianople showed the danger of arrogance. Valens had ignored the advice of his generals, dismissed the strength of his enemy, and rushed into battle for the sake of personal glory. His pride cost him his army, his life, and the stability of his empire. History would remember him not as a conqueror, but as a cautionary tale. Third, the battle changed the very fabric of the empire's relationship with the peoples beyond its borders. Before Adrianople, Rome had sought to dominate and control. After Adrianople, Rome was forced to compromise, to accept barbarians as allies within the empire itself. This shift marked the beginning of a slow erosion of Roman identity. The consequences rippled forward through time. In the years after Adrianople, the Goths remained within imperial borders, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always a destabilizing presence. By the early 5th century, their descendants, under Alaric, would march into Italy and sack the city of Rome itself, a humiliation once thought impossible. The road from Adrianople led directly to that moment. Yet Adrianople also offers a broader lesson, one that echoes across history. Great powers fall not only from external threats, but from internal weakness, arrogance, and failure to adapt. Empires that refuse to understand their enemies, that dismiss warning signs, that believe themselves invulnerable. These empires sow the seeds of their own downfall. Standing on the fields outside modern Edirne, where the city of Adrianople once braced for war, one can still feel the weight of that history. Beneath the soil lie the bones of legions and tribesmen alike, silent witnesses to a clash that reshaped a civilization. The Roman Empire did not die in a single day, but on August 9th, 378, it was mortally wounded. Adrianople was not the end of Rome, but it was the beginning of the end. And from that day forward, the empire was never the same.